Good morning. My name is Chuck Goldman, and I work at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today on the future of U.S. utility customer-funded efficiency programs. I'll be joined today by Galen Barbose, who will be presenting much of the talk, as well as Ian Hoffman and Megan Billingsley, who are co-authors of the report, and hope we'll all be able to field questions. This is an online audio-only webinar. And so we'd like to encourage you to ask your questions, whether they be clarifying or more substantive, in the chat area. And then we will answer those questions at the end of the talk. They'll be fielded by, they'll be put forth by Ian at the end of the talk, and we'll try to group them. We'll try to respond to clarifying questions in the chat and keep the other ones for discussion. Our goal is to have Galen present for on the order of 35 to 40 minutes and leave 15 to 20 minutes for discussion and questions. We're also going to, we're willing to send a PDF of this slide presentation to you if you send an email to Megan Billingsley at the end of the presentation. And I want to note that this work was funded by the Department of Energy's Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability, and we're grateful to them for that support. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Galen.
All right, thanks, Chuck. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Megan, if you could advance to the next slide here. So the overview of this presentation, I'm going to start out by just giving a little bit of background and context on the project itself, talk a little bit about our analytical approach. Then I'll give sort of a brief overview of current energy efficiency program spending trends in the U.S. and the associated policy drivers. I'll then move into what's really kind of the heart of this presentation and of our work, which is a set of projections of customer-funded efficiency program spending and savings through 2025. There are essentially three components to that. Electric program spending, which is kind of the bulk of the analysis, and I'll spend the bulk of the time on that. Electric program savings, and then gas program spending. And then I'll end the presentation by identifying and discussing some of the key issues and uncertainties that underlie our projections and that informed the scenarios that we developed around those projections. Next slide. So over the past 5 to 10 years, policies supporting customer-funded efficiency in the U.S. have proliferated, and those policies have driven a significant growth in program activity over that period. These policies are poised to continue driving growth in program activity going forward, but there is significant uncertainty on a variety of fronts that could influence the ultimate impact of these programs and policies. And so the primary purpose of this study is to help inform really the kind of broad array of industry stakeholders that may have some sort of vested interest in understanding the potential impact of customer-funded efficiency programs over time. This particular study is an update to a similar analysis that we published a few years ago in 2009, where in this most recent study we've extended the projections out to 2025, and more importantly, we've updated the many various underlying assumptions in order to reflect the policy developments that have happened over the intervening period. Next slide. So the product and outcome of our analysis is essentially a set of state-level projections. And as I mentioned specifically, we developed projections for three things: electric program spending, electric program savings, and gas program spending. And the electric spending and savings projections are linked to one another via state-specific assumptions about the cost of savings at different levels of program intensity. And there are details on those assumptions and all the other assumptions about our methodology within the report itself for those that are interested. For each state, we developed the projections based upon a fairly detailed bottom-up review of state policies and program results, DSM, plans, integrated resource plans, and all sorts of other kinds of regulatory documents that pertain to customer-funded efficiency programs. In addition, we also conducted a series of interviews with a variety of program administrators, regulators, and regional energy efficiency organizations. And those interviews were particularly instrumental in helping to shape our scenario assumptions, where for each state we developed low, medium, and high case projections. The definitions and assumptions underlying each scenario are quite state-specific, and so I'll again kind of have to refer folks to the report itself for those details. But in general, the scenarios are intended to reflect uncertainties related both to the implementation and efficacy of the efficiency policies themselves, as well as uncertainties related to the broader policy and market context within which these programs operate. Now, the last point on this slide is something that I want to stress, and that's that we made a very conscious choice in developing our scenarios to really focus on current policies. And so we deliberately did not consider any sort of wholesale shift in either state or federal policy. For example, what would happen if a federal clean energy standard or federal carbon policy were implemented. So certainly the range in potential outcomes could be even broader than the scenarios we've developed, but we'll see as we start going through the analysis that even within this constrained set of scenario assumptions, we still see a pretty wide divergence across the various scenarios. Next slide. So before launching into the projections, I think it would be useful just to look at where we are today and kind of the recent historical trajectory leading up to today. So nationally, efficiency program spending is currently at an all-time high and has increased quite dramatically in recent years. So specifically in 2010, which is really the most recent year for which we have kind of comprehensive data on actual expenditures. In that year, total electric and gas efficiency program spending was about $4.8 billion in the U.S., with electric program spending representing the bulk, about 80% of that. Now, this $4.8 billion in 2010 is more than double the spending from just 4 years prior to that, in 2006, and aggregate budgets since 2010 have increased even further. Now, the other important trend and theme to note here is that the geographical distribution of efficiency program spending has spread over time, and it's done that as states with recently adopted policies have ramped up their efforts. That being said, total spending today in absolute dollar terms still remains pretty highly concentrated within a relatively small number of states. And in particular, you can see in the table here that in 2010, about 2/3 of total U.S. spending was concentrated within about 10 states. Now, of course, part of that is just a function of population distribution, where more populous states tend to have higher levels of spending in absolute dollar terms. But this geographical concentration is also a reflection of the fact that there are still quite a few states that are in the early stages of ramping up their policy implementation or are still testing out the waters. And there are also still a number of states that really haven't made significant policy commitments to customer-funded efficiency programs. So bottom line here is that this geographical concentration has declined somewhat in recent years, but still persists to a certain degree today. Next slide. So I've alluded to this proliferation of state-level policies over the past decade or so, both as being a driver for the recent growth in program spending and also as providing the foundation for our projections. So listed in the table here are the particular types of policies that we modeled in the states in which they exist. And so in order just to kind of understand some of the trends and themes within our projections, I thought it would be helpful just to spend a few minutes discussing this policy landscape. So some of these policy mechanisms listed in the table here are relative newcomers to the energy efficiency policy landscape. And so among this group of relative newcomers, we'd include energy efficiency resource standards, which establish some sort of long-term minimum efficiency savings targets for utilities. Similarly, several other states have instead adopted renewable portfolio standards, RPS policies, or broader alternative energy standards within which energy efficiency is a qualifying resource. And a good portion of the states within both of these first two groups have not, at least until recently, been particularly aggressive on the efficiency front. And so many of these states are still in the process of trying to rapidly develop the regulatory and administrative structures that are needed in order to implement large-scale efficiency programs. And so the sort of uncertainties in how those efforts will play out over time are one of the underlying considerations that went into our range of scenarios. And also within this relatively recent set of policy developments is the third item on the list, states that have either statutory or regulatory requirements that utilities acquire all cost-effective efficiency. And among these states, there are uncertainties as well, both in terms of the size of the cost-effective potential over the long term, and also uncertainties in terms of what kinds of rate impacts are ultimately sustainable and politically acceptable. And so those are some additional dynamics that we also tried to kind of capture within our scenario definitions. Now the other policy drivers listed in the table here, systems benefit charges, integrated resource planning, and DSM program planning, those policy mechanisms have a bit more history to them. IRP and DSM planning in particular have really been common practice in the industry for several decades, but their application in recent years has expanded somewhat, and in some cases that has occurred as a result of spillover or cross-border effects across states within a given region. And in particular, this has started to happen to some extent within the Southeast, especially among some of the multi-jurisdictional utilities in that region. There are, however, lots of uncertainties about how far this expansion might go, and those uncertainties are yet another consideration that go into our set of scenarios. So with that bit of background, I think I'd like to now kind of really move on to the heart of the presentation and discuss the results of our analysis, the projections. So next slide, please. So here we see the bottom line numbers in terms of our projections of total U.S. spending on customer-funded electric and gas efficiency programs across the three scenarios. So within our mid-case, we project spending to essentially double from $4.8 billion in 2010 to $9.5 billion nominal dollars in 2025. And you can see that there's quite a range between the low and the high cases, from $6.5 billion to $15.6 billion in 2025. Now these projections correspond to growth rates, annual average growth rates of about 5% per year in the medium case, versus 2% and 8% per year in the low and high cases, respectively. And so just to put that in a bit of historical context, the 5% growth rate is basically on par with the average growth rate in efficiency program spending that we saw over the decade from 1997 to 2006. And that was the decade following the kind of a big drop-off in program spending that occurred during the electric industry restructuring period in the 1990s. Now, during the last half of the previous decade, from 2006 to 2010, we saw much faster growth, about 26% per year on average in efficiency program spending. And that occurred as a whole host of different states were either adopting new policies or expanding existing policy commitments. And I'll come back to this issue of growth rates in the next slide. But first, just to kind of compare the electric and gas spending projections to one another, it's not perhaps completely obvious on this slide, but we project much higher growth rates for electric program spending than for gas program spending in the low and medium cases. But in contrast, in the high case, the growth rates for gas spending are somewhat higher than for electric. Now, these differing trends largely reflect the fact that electric programs have a much broader base of underlying policy support and a much broader base of historical experience. And so those things, in effect, translate into stronger growth in the low and medium cases for electric programs, but it then leaves a large upside potential for growth in gas program spending under the high case conditions. Next slide, please. So for the next set of slides, we're going to focus really just on electric program spending. As we can see in the table here, across all three scenarios, we project at least some growth in terms of aggregate nominal dollar expenditures for electric efficiency programs. And that's what we see kind of in the leftmost third of the table here, where again we have about a doubling of spending in the medium case relative to 2010, and a quite wide spread between the low and high cases. Now, however, looking at things only in terms of nominal dollars can be perhaps a bit misleading, or at least it only tells kind of part of the story. And so when we express these savings projections as a percentage of total electric utility revenues, you can see that efficiency program spending in terms of that metric also grows in the medium and high case, but in the low case it remains essentially flat at the 2010 level of about 1.1, 1.2% of revenues. And so that low scenario really kind of reflects a future in which regulators and administrators essentially put the brakes on any further program expansion, and many of the states with aggressive savings targets fall short of those goals. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, in the high case, we have a world in which the Energy Efficiency Resource Standard, EERS, targets are fully achieved in most cases, and where states with all cost-effective efficiency policies are able to fully realize those goals, and where program activity in a number of the other states reaches the levels projected for their leading regional peers. Now, last thing here, I mentioned on the previous slide, I kind of referred to this comparison between growth rates in spending for our projections compared to historical growth rates. And I want to just kind of come back to that here and add a little bit more nuance to that discussion. Looking at the right-hand side of the table, you can see that the projected growth in electric program spending is quite front-loaded, with much faster growth projected during the first kind of period through 2015, and then it tapers off quite a bit over the last 5 years. And this dynamic is partly due to the fact that in many states you've got multi-year DSM plans that are on the books and that require some significant increases in spending over the next several years, but there isn't any longer-term set of targets or longer-term resource planning process to continue driving growth beyond the time horizon of the most recent DSM plan. This front-loaded shape is also partly a reflection of just the trajectory of the EERS schedules, where those EERS policies typically reach their terminal target year by 2020, and we will, in those cases, generally assume that program activity sort of remains relatively flat after that point. And then lastly, this kind of diminishing or tapering down trajectory is also just a function of the fact that we've assumed to some extent that the savings potential in those latter years may be diminished somewhat due to the success of programs implemented over the prior decade, and also due to the impact of tightening federal efficiency standards over the period leading up as well. Next slide. So we can classify states according to their dominant policy driver for electric program spending. And we can do this in order to say something about which policies are, at the national level at least, most instrumental in driving projected spending growth. And so we can see here, looking at there are 22 states that have an EERS, an RPS with EE eligibility, and or an all cost-effective energy efficiency mandate. And so among those 22 states, they represent essentially 3/4 of all spending in the medium case. And that's both a reflection of the importance of those policies and the aggressiveness of those policies, as well as being a consequence of the fact that that set of policies, they are themselves characteristic of states that, at least in some cases, have historically had fairly strong commitments to customer-funded efficiency programs. And so our projections, in effect, are reflecting a continuation of those historical trends. Now, the remaining quarter or so of total U.S. spending in the medium case is associated primarily with the additional 18 states where electric program efficiency spending is driven primarily by either a DSM planning process or an IRP process without any accompanying long-term savings goal. Next slide. So projected trends in total U.S. Electric efficiency program spending are, to some extent, an overlay of quasi-regional trends. And for our purposes here, we're grouping states into the 4 U.S. Census regions, and the figure here shows the 2025 projections broken out by region for each of the 3 scenarios. And so in general, we can see that growth in total U.S. electric program spending is being driven in large measure by the Midwest and South, where in the Midwest there's a contingent of relatively populous states that are currently ramping up to meet relatively aggressive statutory EERS targets. And in the South, the projected increases are associated with kind of a collection of relatively modest EERS policies in a number of states and or some initial forays into IRP or DSM planning in some other states. And the thing with the South is just that the states are relatively large in terms of their energy consumption, so that even modestly aggressive savings targets can translate into fairly significant amounts of spending in absolute dollar terms. Now in the West and Northeast, where efficiency activity has historically been quite strong, we also project increased spending in the medium case, but by lesser amounts than in the other 2 regions. And that largely just reflects the more mature state of those markets. In the Northeast in particular, you can see that efficiency program spending is projected to increase under all 3 of the scenarios, where the variation across scenarios in part reflects differing assumptions assumptions how the all cost-effective efficiency mandates in those states are implemented, as well as differing assumptions about sort of the degree of concern about potential rate impacts. And then last, in the West, the regional trends are heavily influenced by California, being the largest state in the West, and where electric program spending in the medium and low cases actually declines over the long term based on the latest potential studies and goal-setting process in that state. Next slide. So the differing regional trends that we just talked about imply a continued shifting of the energy efficiency map and a even more even distribution in spending across regions. And so in particular, you can see here in this figure that in 2010, the West and the Northeast, kind of the traditional bastions of energy efficiency, accounted for more than 70% of total U.S. efficiency program spending, electric efficiency program spending. In comparison, under our medium case projection, that percentage, the sum of the West and the Northeast, declines to just over 50% in 2025, with the South and Midwest splitting the remainder more or less evenly. Now, the choice of metric is very important here. And so although the distribution here becomes relatively even across regions in terms of absolute spending levels, the picture is a little bit different when spending is expressed on a relative basis, as we'll see on the next slide, please. So here we're showing electric efficiency program spending over time for each region, again in the medium case, but here we're expressing spending as a percentage of electric utility revenues. And so just kind of, I guess, skipping to the last one on the slide here, you can see that the relative spending level in the South is still projected to remain well below the other regions, while relative spending in the Midwest does actually rise to the same level as in the West and Northeast. And so, I mean, that suggests that no matter which way you look at it, whichever metric you choose here, the aggressive EERS policies among Midwestern states are on track to put the region really into kind of an unprecedented leadership position for the region. That, of course, is contingent on whether or not the aggressive EERS targets in those states are ultimately achieved. Next slide. So as electric program spending grows, so does the savings associated with those programs, though not necessarily in direct proportion. As I indicated earlier, our electric spending and electric savings projections are coupled together based on a set of state-specific assumptions about the cost of achieving a given unit of savings at different levels of program intensity. And based on those relationships, we can translate spending into savings and vice versa. Now the table here presents electric program savings expressed in terms of annual incremental electricity savings in units of terawatt hours. And so for those of you that aren't familiar with this term, annual incremental savings really just essentially refers to the first year savings achieved from measures implemented in any given year. And so what we can see here that in our medium case, we're projecting a little bit more than a 50% increase in electricity savings relative to 2010, whereas in the low case, savings remain roughly flat, and in the high case, savings more than double. Next slide. So what does all of this mean in the big picture? One way to put these savings projections into a larger context is to compare them to projected load growth. And to do this, it's useful to first express the projected savings as a percentage of retail electric sales, which is what we've done in the figure here. And so you can see, for example, that in the medium case, annual incremental savings rise to 0.76% of total U.S. retail electricity sales in 2025. For a projection of U.S. Retail electricity sales growth, we can look at the EIA's reference case forecast from their 2012 annual energy outlook. That forecast projects that total U.S. retail electricity sales will grow by about 0.58% per year, compounded annually through 2025. And this is a very low growth rate by any sort of historical standard in the U.S. Now, as those of you who are familiar with EIA's modeling system now, they know, the modeling system, it doesn't explicitly account for customer-funded energy efficiency program impact. It does, however, have lots of knobs and levers that allow it to be calibrated to historical trends. And that calibration allows the model to at least indirectly and implicitly capture the impact of future customer-funded efficiency programs to some degree, but not necessarily in their entirety. And so given this ambiguity, we'll say, in EIA's forecast and the extent to which it captures the future impact of customer-funded efficiency programs, I want to present an if-then statement. And that statement is, if we assume that EIA's forecast of retail electricity sales reflects a continuation of the average savings from customer-funded programs over the 2000 to 2010 period, and that was on average about 0.2% per year in terms of annual incremental savings. If we make that assumption, then the projected efficiency savings under our medium case scenario would largely offset forecasted electricity load growth. Now, the math here is fairly rudimentary and is explained in the report. And in any case, I don't want to get too hung up on the specific numbers here, because really the big picture is simply that in a world with very modest underlying drivers for load growth, as is the case in EIA's latest reference case forecast, the kind of efficiency savings trajectories that we're projecting could quite easily lead to flat or even in our high case, negative load growth over the next 10 to 15 years. Next slide, please.
Galen, you're starting to chop out in some of the words, so maybe you could talk either a little bit slower or bring the mic closer to you, but some people are having trouble noticing some words are cutting out.
Okay. I'll try talking slower. So the presentation up until this point has been very electric focused. And we haven't talked much about the gas projections specifically. Now that bias is in part a reflection of our analysis itself, which is much more detailed and in-depth on the electric side. That said, I do want to very quickly present a little bit of material on our projections for customer-funded gas program spending. And the figure here shows projected gas program spending in absolute dollar terms for the three scenarios. As I mentioned in passing earlier, our projections for gas efficiency have a very different trajectory than the electric projections. Before I go on, is the sound quality better or still the same?
A little better.
Okay. Well, I will continue on then. In all three of our scenarios here for the gas spending projections, we project some bump up in total gas program spending during the initial period from 2010 to 2015, and that initial bump up is largely associated with gas DSM plans that have already been filed or approved, and so that spending growth is in some sense kind of hardwired into the system or into our analysis. But then from 2015 onward, we project essentially flat spending in the medium case and declining spending in the low case. And those bearish trends are intended to largely reflect two major underlying dynamics, those being low natural gas pricing and tightening federal efficiency standards for gas appliances. Now, one relatively recent development here since we published this report is that there's been some kind of retrenchment of the gas furnace standards, and so that can certainly have some implications for our projections on the gas side, but we won't really know much until the standard setting process kind of runs its course. And in any case, at least over the near term, we're still looking at quite low natural gas prices, and so that dynamic in and of itself probably would really cause the trends that the projections we've developed to persist, even in light of this latest development. Now, our high case diverges quite dramatically from the other two cases, and the basic underlying assumption in our high case is that gas program savings in the leading states rise to levels that are on par with current leading states for electric efficiency. Now, what this means, in effect, is that gas program savings start getting up to the neighborhood of about 1% to 1.5% of retail gas. And so I'm getting messages here that the audio is not very well.
You want me to take over?
Let me try. I put my headset into a different USB port on my computer. Maybe that will work better. How is that? Any better?
Yes.
Okay. So as I was saying, our high case gas projections essentially assume that kind kind of leading states on the gas efficiency front start getting up into the neighborhood of about 1% to 1.5% of retail gas sales in terms of savings. And to actually achieve that from gas programs would almost certainly require that programs really dramatically expand to reach larger customers in much greater numbers, including transportation gas customers or non-core customers, which in this context refers to customers that are purchasing their gas from a competitive commodity provider and having it delivered through the regulated gas company's distribution system. Next slide, please. So as we've seen, our spending and savings projections span quite a wide range across the three scenarios. And I wanted to wrap up this talk by identifying and briefly discussing some of the key issues and uncertainties that informed our development of those scenarios. And I want to do that with sort of full disclosure of the caveats that these issues are both not exhaustive. There are certainly other important issues. And in addition, there is some sort of overlap and interrelationship between these, and hopefully I'll kind of try to hint at some of those interrelationships as I go through them. So the first set of issues here pertain to the broader market and policy context that customer-funded programs operate within. And at the top of this list is the economy. And the economy impacts efficiency program activity really in many different kinds of ways. It affects customers' willingness to make investments. It affects regulators' willingness to authorize increased ratepayer funding. And it affects the size of the efficiency resource base and the value of energy efficiency, especially if you're in a region that has already very low load growth and very little need for new generating capacity. The second on the list here is natural gas prices, which I've mentioned, and are at a 10-year low, thanks to the boom in shale gas extraction in recent years. Most projections of natural gas prices and gas price futures do show prices rebounding to some degree, but the extent and timing of that rebound are highly uncertain. And this has significant implications for the cost effectiveness of customer-funded efficiency programs, both electric and gas, but of course particularly gas programs. Third, there are some big uncertainties surrounding future changes to federal and state minimum efficiency standards for appliances and lighting. Those standards, they affect the customer-funded efficiency program landscape because these minimum standards raise the baseline for customer-funded voluntary programs and reduce the potential, the savings potential that can be achieved through those programs. Now, kind of the other side of the coin for this issue is the question of the extent to which appliance manufacturers are able to continue developing higher efficiency models that exceed the minimum standards, so that as the floor is lifted, the ceiling is lifted in a corresponding way as well. So those are some important uncertainties. And then the last item on the list here is the question of what role energy efficiency programs might play in helping utilities to comply with federal air regulations that may require the retrofit or retirement of coal-fired plants. And the uncertainties here relate both to the stringency of the regulations themselves, as well as to the attractiveness of efficiency relative to other compliance options, including natural gas-fired generation. Next slide. Now, there are a whole host of other issues and uncertainties related to the more proximate regulatory and administrative environment within which these programs operate. The first of these is the fact that the rate impacts of energy efficiency programs tend to be relatively front-loaded, and those impacts can be met with varying degrees of political resistance. And certainly the extent of that resistance can be greater during periods of economic turmoil and hardship. And furthermore, in some cases, in some states, there are some fairly specific barriers related to rate impacts, specifically where you have either explicit rate caps on efficiency program spending or the use of the RIM test, Ratepayer Impact Measure test. Second item on the list here, savings targets that have been established in a number of states simply cannot be achieved with the traditional suite of programs. And so there is a continuing need to develop innovative program designs that achieve both deeper savings on average at individual customer facilities and that also have much broader reach in terms of the market penetration over a sustained period of time. Third, as I mentioned in connection with the gas projections specifically, significant increases in gas program spending over the long run will require that programs are able to reach deeply into the base of large commercial and industrial customers. And the challenge here is that these customers, as I mentioned, often purchase their natural gas on the competitive market through alternative retailers, and these customers may not currently be able to participate in the efficiency programs offered by the local gas utility. And so whether or not these customers can be kind of brought into the fold may ultimately require, in some cases, regulatory changes in order to extend program eligibility and extend program funding mechanisms to include these customers as well. And then finally, the last point here is the need to develop sustainable and compelling business models for energy efficiency program administrators. And this is really an overarching challenge that in some sense touches on all of the other issues mentioned, both on this slide and the previous one, as it affects the motivation of utilities and program administrators more generally to participate constructively and effectively in resolving these various issues. So this is yet another important issue and uncertainty that kind of informed, whether directly or indirectly, our set of projections. Next slide. So with that, I'd like to bring the presentation portion of the webinar to a close. I want to thank all of you for listening in and bearing with the technical difficulties. Hopefully they weren't too disruptive. I want to, before moving on to Q&A, I do want to just thank all my co-authors on this. I was the one that sort of drew the short straw, as it were, to give the presentation, but Chuck, Ian, and Megan all were integral parts of this project, and so they deserve a great deal of credit for all the work that I just presented. And then also kind of echoing Chuck's acknowledgement at the beginning, just to extend our gratitude to our benefactors at the Department of Energy for funding this work. So with that, I think we're going to enter into the Q&A portion of the webinar, and I believe Ian has been kind of collating questions over the chat page, and we'll be throwing them at myself, and hopefully Chuck and others can jump in and help answer some of these questions.
Yeah, thanks, Galen. And so we're going to start off actually with a number of gas-related questions that came in over the course of the webinar. The first of these is, and I think you touched on this, but why did we not forecast gas program savings as long as we're forecasting the spending levels for those for gas programs?
I think the short answer is that, well, there are probably two answers, or two parts of the answer. One is that we don't have nearly as good of data on the gas side as we do on the electric side about the cost of savings. And so sort of developing a coupled set of projections would be, quite a bit more speculative on the gas side, especially if you're dealing with, especially for states where we're projecting a significant departure from current spending levels. And so I think that was probably the most important reason. I think the other reason is that the policies on the gas side tend to be less savings driven and more spending driven. That's not entirely true, but to a degree that's true. And so for that reason, I think we also tended to stay more focused on the spending side. That being said, our high case gas spending projection is actually driven by some underlying savings assumptions for many of the states, where we're assuming that states get up to about 1 to 1.5% of retail gas sales. And so in that case, we did actually have to apply some assumptions about the cost of savings for gas, but we did that only for that scenario, not for the others.
Okay. And another question that is how do we do we have any good examples of extending EE programs to transportation gas? What examples or opportunities there? We do have some note out of the Pacific Northwest, and thanks, Jim, that the gas transportation customers, when they've been opportunities to audit them, that the audits have discovered a fair amount of savings with a less than 2-year payback. But do you know of any other examples right off the top of your head?
So I'm going to take this one. I think a lot of it has to do with how states set up their gas programs and how they try to recover the cost for them. I mean, it's clear that non-core customers have oftentimes argued that they shouldn't be subject to either paying in or getting benefits. In other states, there are ways to put the cost on a distribution charge part of the gas bill and to offer those programs to all customers. But it is a political discussion, and states have approached it differently. I think many people in the gas, there are some significant technical opportunities in the larger non-core market, but some of those customers have argued that they can deal with that stuff on their own through the competitive retailers that they deal with, as well as their own investment decisions. And so that's part of the reason that it's really sort of a gray area and quite speculative in terms of whether we're going to move in that direction in the future.
Okay. And here's another one either of you might take is how do codes and standards enter into our study?
I would just make
go ahead,
Chuck, you want to
one
lead
comment.
On?
Most of the existing efficiency resource standards are written in such a fashion that they cover voluntary customer-funded programs. They don't explicitly have savings goals articulated in terms of you can use a variety of strategies, code standards, or programs. So our analysis is primarily based on the fact of how the legislation is written and how it's implemented by regulators. And Galen may want to add to that.
No, I mean, I think that basically covers the essence, I think.
Okay. One question is a couple of questions here on the savings versus load growth calculation or assessment. Do any of the projections lead to energy efficiency offsetting all of a state's load growth? And if so, is there a steep drop-off in energy efficiency cost effectiveness to the point where it no longer offsets capacity and T&D investments, i.e. it's just fuel?
So we actually we didn't actually do that calculation. I mean, I would assume and assert that is the case, and that there are some states where load growth is being completely eliminated in the median case. I mean, we see, at a national level that it's more or less flattening growth. So I think it stands to reason that in some states there may be a downward bend. But I think our focus, even though we sort of built things up from a state level, at the end of the day, our hope is really to kind of describe sort of these broader national and regional trends. And so that's been the emphasis in this presentation and in the report as well.
Okay. And we also have a question that given that the 2011 estimates of spending are up to about $7 billion, aren't we already kind of on a high growth path? would things really actually have to slow down to hit only 8.1 billion by 2025? Chuck, do you want to
take a shot at that? So I think it's fair to say that we've historically, LBL tends to take a pretty conservative approach to sort of this stuff. We're sort of, a lot of times we've been sort of between, the actual activities have been sort of between the medium and the high. I think the low scenario is historically it's a lower probability than the other two. So I wouldn't put a lot of credence to it in terms of a high probability, but pretty low. I would point out that when you look at much of the other data that's out there, oftentimes what's reported is budgets, not spending, and historically spending has lagged authorized budgets. And second, sometimes some of the studies include either North America, not just the U.S., or they include load management as well as efficiency. So you need to sort of look closely at what's being covered in the scope. We're pretty confident that this is a really pretty detailed, bottoms-up, comprehensive analysis of efficiency. And we'd love to be on the high trajectory, but we see lots of cautionary notes out there, and so we try to give a range of scenarios that reflect different kinds of future paths, which depend on the political will of regulators and the motivations of administrators and customer uptake.
And so here's one for Galen. How does the marginal cost of reduction or savings change over time? Will it be cheaper to reduce energy in the later years, or do they become increasingly more expensive?
Yeah, that's a great question, and actually this is a technical issue that we discussed a bit and grappled with for this project. And in the end, we don't really have any direct sort of temporal sort of factor in our cost of savings assumptions. Really, the cost of savings are driven by the intensity of the program activity, and so as if in a given state the program intensity becomes higher over time, then the cost of savings will change. And depending where you sort of are within intensity levels, the cost of savings can increase over time as a state goes to sort of higher levels of savings. So yeah, I think to be honest, I think that there probably is an additional sort of temporal dimension to it. But I think given really the resolution that we had available to us, it really wasn't kind of realistic to kind of impose that additional dimension. But I think that's really a great question.
I would add two comments to Galen's. One, there seems to be a trade-off between administrative costs and incentives to customers. So when administrators are just starting out, they often incur fairly significant upfront startup costs for administration, and then as programs ramp up and savings increase, in relative terms, administration costs may decline as a percentage of total budget, somewhat. But then on the other hand, as you sort of go up the efficiency supply curve and you get the low-hanging fruit, particularly in leading states, we see that oftentimes you might have to offer incentives that are either higher to achieve saving goals or to get uptake of products that are harder to sell. And then third is lots of this issue about the cost of savings has to do with, again, the willingness of regulators to accept rate impacts and how savings goals are articulated. So it's not just it's a little bit more subtle than just looking for what may happen over time. And we are trying to do analysis that looks at the cost of savings over time and try to add in that temporal dimension that Galen talks about. But right now we didn't feel like we had the data to support that kind of additional thing other than some notion of what happens to costs with increasing savings targets.
Okay, Chuck, and maybe you want to grab this one as well. It says, to the extent that energy efficiency programs are successful and in the current low demand growth environment, what impacts might you see on utility revenue requirements?
I'll let Galen take that one. I mean, I think revenue
Thanks,
requirements,
Chuck.
to be honest, are no, I mean, utility, I don't think it's huge. I think it's pretty small because these programs are relatively small parts of large utilities budgets. So, you know, they're just, it's not when you compare that to capacity additions or retirements and replacements, as well as changes in fuel prices, I don't think that's a huge driver. It certainly affects load growth and it affects the business model, but I'm not sure it's the classic thing we observe is that in aggregate, rates go up a little bit and customer bills go down. And that's what happens when you do good efficiency programs. Compared to the alternative, that depends.
Okay. Let me see. There is that's about it for the questions that we have so far. If there are any other questions, this is a good time to pass them along. We have
some comments from our audience, Ian, that I'd like to add to the last question, which is I think Jim Lazar and Jeff Schlegel point out that revenue requirements may well go down if the programs are quite cost effective and rates may increase. And Jeff points out that this issue of revenue requirements impacts probably is a bigger deal for wires-only utilities than vertically integrated utilities.
Okay. Galen, we also have a clarifying question here. Can you talk just a little bit more about all cost-effective policies and how we modeled those, and the degree to which there's variability from state to state in how all cost-effective mandates are implemented, and again, how we account for those differences.
Yeah, well, actually, probably Ian, you and Megan are maybe have those details closer to your fingertips. And I think, at least in the northeastern states, where these mandates exist, we relied on energy efficiency potential studies that had been conducted for those states. And so those were really kind of the underlying, those provided the underlying savings assumptions that then got coupled to the spending projections. Now, for those states, our scenarios, as I mentioned at one point, reflect different assumptions about the degree to which concerns about rate impacts become binding. And so for some of those northeastern states, we did, in certain scenarios, once the cost of the program got up to, say, 10% of total utility electric revenue, we would cap it. And that was how we defined one of the scenarios, something along those lines. And I think, as I mentioned again, that all the details for individual states, those are all in the report itself. Fortunately or not, I no longer can retain all of those pieces of information in my head. But if folks are interested, we have, I didn't mention on the last slide, still showing on the screen here, we have the URL for the report. So that's obviously a publicly available document, and I would encourage folks to download it if you haven't already. And if folks have follow-up questions about the report or about this presentation, please feel free to send an email or a phone call to myself or Chuck or any of the other co-authors on the report.
Maybe one additional point. Lots of the details on the actual methodology and the state-specific assumptions are in an appendix to that main report.
Yes.
We should also add that if anyone wants a copy of this particular presentation, if you'll just email Megan Billingsley at the address that's listed here on this last slide, we'll make sure we get you a copy.
So if there aren't any more questions coming in, Ian, I think in untypical LBL fashion, we're going to try to end this webinar on time. And Galen did a great job of keeping within our time budget. And we've had a really nice discussion in the chat here in terms of all this stuff. And I hope that we've helped try to clarify some of the points in this report and hopefully motivate you to sort of take a closer look at it and think about it in the context of how you do your work in your state. And with that, I'd like to close and thank you all for attending.
Yeah. Thank you all.